With the ability to use materials like wood and even metal, CNC machines can create projects unlike any other. But for a long time, this technology hasn't been very accessible to beginners and hobbyists who are interested in what a machine like this could unlock in their work. The Makera Z1 is hoping to change that. It claims to be a smart, entry-level CNC machine with pro-level power. So today, we're putting it to the test to see if it lives up to those promises. First thing is, of course, to get this machine out of the box. This is technically a pre-production unit that Makera very kindly sent over for me to test out early. I've been told this particular one is basically what the final units will be, other than some refining and possible bug fixes. One thing I do hope they refine is the amount of tape on this box, because I was having to work to get into this thing. But once I did manage to get the box open, there is this singular large piece of foam that you pull out, and then inside you basically just have the entire machine. Everything is packaged within the Z1, so you really just pull the entire thing out and then continue to remove the various plastic that's covering it. I'm sure the internal packaging is going to vary slightly depending on the particular person's unit, because this one was packaged with all of the extra accessories included within that stack of boxes and then just padded around with foam. There really isn't any assembly to be had with this machine, so we're going to start taking a look at what's inside of all of these different boxes. First one was the only one that was obviously labeled, and that is the laser module box. Because yes, you do have the option to add this module if you want the Z1 to have laser engraving capabilities as well. In the second mystery cardboard box, we have multiple mystery packages. It always feels like Christmas opening these machines because I never know what's really going to be within these various packets. I started off with the one labeled accessory pack, and we had a lot of great stuff in here, including some bit collars, an emergency stop button, a USB cable, something called a sliding rail guide block, a tool setter rod, which is kind of like a different type of probe, safety glasses, and a power cord. Next up in the toolkit bag, as the name would suggest, we have a bunch of tools. First up, we have the L bracket, then the hex key screwdriver, a spindle collet wrench, alignment pins, the bit collet installer, a couple of clamps, and a couple of different lengths of bolts to help secure material to the machine. There's also a packet of some different types of tool bits. The third and final mystery bag was labeled as the material bag, which again is reasonably self-explanatory. You have a few different material samples to be able to use in the machine. There's a piece of aluminum, some epoxy tool board, dual color acrylic, so it is metallic on the front side and black on the back. So when you start cutting into it, you're left with the darker color, and then a couple of sheets of MDF board. There's also a sanding sponge and mini handsaw. In the separate larger mystery envelope is an extra spoil board. There's already one of these installed in the machine, so it's nice that you get an extra to be able to replace once the original starts getting really cut into. And in the final mystery box, we have the fourth axis module. To me, this is by far the most exciting additional accessory because it allows you to truly create three-dimensional objects. Inside the box, other than the main module, you have the corresponding tools and then some epoxy tooling stock. But I'm going to start with machining flat objects first. So to set up the machine for that, I'm going to first install the right angle bracket on the lower left corner of the build plate. This helps with aligning the material properly. The tool head ships with a blank bit installed already on it, so you're also going to want to remove that. And all that's left to do after that is to plug in the power cable and turn the machine on. The first project that I decided to try was turning this dagger model of mine into a ring. I know this dagger comes up a lot in my videos, but it's one of my favorite props ever made, and the concept of making a ring version of it was too intriguing to not try. To get this file set up for the Z1 to machine, I'm using Makera's own CAM software for this, which is basically the slicer of the CNC world, and you always want to start by inputting the type and size of material that you're going to be using. I'm using a sheet of aluminum for this to get the machine to make this piece as a flat relief and then bend it into the right ring size for me. One huge benefit of Makera CAM is that it has all of the bit settings for the various materials pre-programmed, so you can make adjustments if you want, but for anyone just starting out or wants to not have to worry about more settings, this is super helpful. Since I'm running this project as a 3D relief, I first selected a flat end mill to remove the excess material faster, and then an engraving bit for the final pass to get all of that awesome detail engraved into the piece. I also made sure to limit the depth of these paths so that it wouldn't cut all of the way through the material because we want to use a separate contour path for that. You'll need to add tabs to the outline the software generates so that the piece doesn't come loose while the machine is still working on it. Before starting the project, we'll need to secure our aluminum stock to the bed of the Z1 using a combination of various clamps and bolts so that the material doesn't move around as it's being machined. Once the job is selected, you'll start with inserting one of the probes into the tool head. In most cases, that will be the wired probe that's located on the side of the tool head. Once you confirm the probe's being inserted, it will home to the home button that's on the back right corner of the build plate. From there, depending on your settings, it will at the very least probe the material to confirm the depth of where your stock is in relation to the tool head. You can get it to probe multiple spots if you're using a more uneven material, and it can also scan the perimeter of the work area with the laser that's built into the wired probe to make sure everything is aligned correctly. If everything looks good, you can remove the wired probe from the tool head and then insert your first tool bit. And this is using a fairly quick release system that involves just pulling the lever that's on the side of the tool head to either install or uninstall any particular bits. Once the bit change is confirmed, it will also home itself on that back homing button before starting the cutting process of your project. I should also mention that throughout this video, I was remotely sending the G-code files to the machine via the Z1's Wi-Fi network. That's also how I was controlling it, but there is a USB port if you prefer a wired connection. The majority of the machine footage throughout this video is going to be sped up just for time's sake, but for reference, this is what the machine looks like in real time. It will vary depending on the type of material that the machine is cutting and its speed settings. Once it had finished the first pass with the flat end mill, I switched out the bit to the engraving bit for the final pass. In the grand scheme of things, only using 2 bits for a project is kind of low. There's really not a limit to how many bits you might need or want to use for any given project, depending on the complexity of the piece. Once the machine had finished the engraving process, I then switched back to the first flat end bit so that it could cut out this dagger. Seeing these pieces come to life is still so mind-blowing for me, especially when they have this level of detail. This thing looked incredible as is, but I did go ahead and polish it up to make it look even better. It was very impressive to see the level of detail the Z1 was able to achieve on this reasonably small piece. But since I did intend for this to be a ring, the final step was bending this into a ring shape. And here's how that turned out. Overall, a really fun and impressive first project, also a great first impression of this machine. And yes, the ring does fit me perfectly, always a good day when things actually work out well in the end. But from there, I wanted to try working with some wood, and I just so happened to need a gift for my uncle, so I turned a photo of his car into a relief to then engrave out of this wood plaque. I used the same processing technique as I did for the ring, where I removed the majority of the material with a flat end mill and then went in with an engraving bit to detail and clean up everything. Only this time I didn't cut the design out, I left it as a recessed part of the solid plaque. Since this plaque was a larger and more awkward piece, I used a combination of both clamps and some two-way tape to try and secure this down to the bed. This is what it looked like straight off of the Z1, but I went ahead and cleaned it up a little bit and also varnished the entire thing. Definitely a different type of project for me, but I do think it turned out really awesome looking, and it was a big hit with my uncle, which is the most important part. Since everything had been going well so far, I decided to be extra ambitious with this huge chunk of cherry wood. This piece nearly maxed out the work area of the Z1, to the point that the only way that I could secure this to the bed was using two-way tape, a very generous amount so that it didn't go anywhere. But my plan for this piece of wood was to turn it into a very cool Princess Mononoke mask. The model I found already had a bit of that worn wood texture, and I thought it might look even more impressive out of actual wood. Even though this seems like a reasonably straightforward project, very similar to the other ones that I've already done so far, the thickness of this piece of wood meant that I had to get the machine to not just cut out the mask, but go to the edge of the material to clear it all away so that the tool head won't hit it as it works its way down to the bottom of the mask. And this was a very lengthy process. Obviously, it's quite a large piece, but I also realized too late that I made a stupid mistake with the second tool path, which meant it was essentially going to take twice as long as it needed to. And then when I was finally starting to see the light at the end of the final tool path, disaster struck. And I'm still not exactly sure what happened. Obviously the bit broke, but that doesn't exactly explain the giant gouge that it then took out of the side of the mask. Because, you know, if the bit breaks, it's just not going to hit anything, so I'm not sure if it maybe got caught up somewhere and it essentially lost its position. It's just going to be one of those mysteries. So yeah, this was kind of crushing that it had taken so long and then it turned out so badly. In the bottom section, you can see how it was turning out and it was looking so cool, but I was not willing to give up on this piece, and thankfully with this being a mask of a warrior, I figured we could roll with this slash across the face. So not only did I oil up this mask to really bring out the cherry wood, I also added a few more scratches and just generally sanded down the areas that the machine hadn't been able to get to. And overall, I think that's a reasonable save of this piece. Obviously was not my first plan for what I wanted this mask to look like, but still an incredibly impressive piece, even though it is technically a fail. But after that slightly heartbreaking experience, I wanted to move on to something a little more simple. As you might have noticed, you end up assigning tool numbers to the various bits, and then the machine will tell you which bit number to switch to, and it can be very helpful to have some sort of holder that you can set up in advance with the bits that you need for a particular project. So I designed this while technically drawing, at least for now, that will be turning into a 3-dimensional tool holder. You can equally import 2D drawing models as you can 3D models, and then assign various depths and processes to properly machine the piece you want. Even though this bit holder is a more simple shape than something like the mask, it is more technically challenging as you're having to figure out the exact depths you want the various pockets machined at, and if you want any other more specific processes. For instance, I ended up having to use a smaller ball nose bit for the numbers since they were a lot smaller than the pockets for the tool bits. I also ended up having to switch to a longer flat end mill to be able to cut out this entire piece since the wood that I was going to be using was so thick. And I also decided to chamfer the outside edge to give it a nice finished look. After checking the G-code preview, everything was looking good, so I went ahead and started the job. This time around I'm using some walnut, also quite a large piece of wood. Clearly did not learn my lesson too well from the last time, and this also was being held to the bed with one clamp that I managed to fit on, but mostly a lot of 2A tape. Thankfully this time though, this was quite a quick process, at least compared to the mask. I would say the majority of the time spent on the mask was just travel time across the already cut piece, whereas for this bit holder it was a lot more efficient and pretty much all of the time was spent cutting something out. Because before I knew it, it was onto the final chamfering pass around the edge, and I had a finished bit holder. I know it's a reasonably simple shaped project, but it turned out so clean. Very professional looking if I do say so myself, but I felt that the side was looking a little plain, so I stuck it down again with some 2A tape so that I could add the Makera Z1 logo to the side. I figured it might as well match the machine since I was making this to be used with the Z1. And here's how it turned out once I had brushed all the excess dust off, added some oil to really bring out the color of the wood, and some rubber feet. And I'm happy to say that the bit cases, as well as the bits themselves, fit perfectly in this. In fact, it might have been a bit loose. The Z1 is very accurate with its machining, so I could have been a lot tighter with my offset values for the pockets, but I guess I'll just have to make those adjustments next time. Rotating the material to machine multiple sides got me thinking about flipping the material to produce a more 3-dimensional shape, this time trying to recreate Makera the Korok from the Zelda series out of some wood. This was again a very thick piece of wood that posed the same challenges as the mask, but this time I tried to be smarter and more careful about how I set up my tool paths, especially since I was going to need to be flipping this piece of material to then machine the backside. The front turned out perfectly, exactly I was expecting it to, but the one thing I got a bit concerned about was the amount of material left that I was going to need to try to stick down and hold in place to machine the back. I really should have been spending my time machining custom clamps for all of this thick material I was insisting on using, but the tape and prayers was going to have to do for now. In a moment of paranoia, I also added some painter's tape to the sides to try to increase the contact area with the bed. Doesn't exactly look professional, but it did work. And by some miracle, this actually ended up turning out. So I managed to get the body to be suspended mid-air by these 4 tabs that thankfully broke away super easily, like maybe concerningly easily. This piece is going to involve a little more work from me just because I couldn't quite cut all of the way due to needing to keep this body suspended mid-air and not cut all the way through. So there's a bit of cleanup on the back I'm going to need to round out and sand down. But overall, I would say that was a pretty successful test. impressed given that it essentially machined 2 flat sides into this 3-dimensional object. He did still need his little leaf face though, so I used a different type of wood for this so that it would contrast with the rest of his body, and all put together and cleaned up, here is how Makera turned out. If I went to do this again, I might try to separate them into halves and then join them, just so that I didn't have to work around the constraints of needing to keep the single figure suspended in midair as it was trying to machine. After that, I figured it was about time to start working on some more complex 3-dimensional shapes using the 4th axis module. To install it on the machine, you first put a couple of alignment pins into the holes on the bed before sitting the module on top of the pins to help line everything up. If you're using it for the first time, the chuck end is a little pushed in for shipping, so you need to loosen the bolts there and slide it so that it lines up with the end of the module plate. Lastly is securing the module base plate to the base plate of the machine and then plugging it in. The plug connection is located in the back left corner of the machine, covered by a dust cover that you'll need to remove. I unfortunately didn't actually manage to capture myself plugging in the cable because my head was in the way. To test out this 4th axis module and its capabilities, I thought it might be a cool idea to attempt a solid metal hydrospanner from Star Wars. This was in multiple parts, so I put a bar between all of the separate pieces that I knew I could fit on the one piece of my material. That way it's going to machine it all as one piece, and then I will just remove that bar later on once everything's finished. These being separate pieces also meant that I could select the individual parts and choose if I wanted to go in with a smaller bit to add more detail, and do essentially a finishing pass. This project was not only going to be in multiple parts, but I was also going to need to use multiple pieces of stock for it. For installing the stock, first it's recommended to mark a center line and drill a small hole into one end for easier alignment. Then you can insert the piece of material into the chuck, move the second part of the vise so that the point is stuck into the hole you drilled, and then just make sure that everything is nice and tight and secure. You still use the wired probe at the beginning of the job, only this time it will trace the length of the material to show you where it will be cutting, and then moves to probe a single point on the module. But after that, it's the same idea of installing your first tool bit and just letting the machine work its magic. For 4th axis machining, the tool head will line itself up with your stock and then move across the same point back and forth, while the chuck is what will then rotate itself to create your 3-dimensional object. At least for the initial passes, it's generally recommended that your roughen passes move horizontally and then your final passes be vertical to really get in that detail. I personally think it's always fascinating to watch these machines work, but especially when it's doing a 4th axis machining. You go from having a very basic shape of stock to all of a sudden it looks like what you were planning on making. Once I had all of my pieces machined, I cut the excess off, polished it, and then assembled it just with some glue this time around. This was like a very rudimentary way of machining this tool. I also didn't want to polish it too much because I didn't feel like it would look appropriate for this thing to be like a perfectly chrome, sparkling shiny, and I also kind of like that you could see some of the manufacturing marks. I think it gives it character, but to make this thing look even more in universe, I decided to go ahead and do a weathering pass over the entire piece with some oil paint. It always looks crazy, but you really just sort of slap this stuff all over the place and then wipe it off with a paper towel, and it will leave the paint in the recessed areas to really give the part depth and dimension. You know, make it look like it's a used tool and not just this perfect aluminum piece. If you don't wipe it off too much, it will also have the effect of sort of staining the entire metal to make it more of a gunmetal look as opposed to that lighter aluminum color. And here's what the hydrospanner looks like now after all of that weathering. The machining is a little messy in areas just because I didn't realize it wasn't cutting in certain parts on the initial pass, and then it was trying to do these horizontal lines vertically as it was spinning, so it got a little weird in spots, but overall I think it's still a really cool piece. As always, I wanted to wrap this video up by giving you my final thoughts and just a general summary of what my experience has been like so far using the Makera Z1. I tried to do a variety of different projects, but specifically ones that would showcase that even though this is a smaller CNC machine, it's still very capable of producing large, impressive pieces. I stuck to wood and metal this time, as they are typically the materials that I'm needing for my CNC projects, but you can also machine acrylic and other plastics, plastics, obviously a large variety of different types of wood and also different metals, carbon fiber sheets, custom PCBs, probably even more that I can't think of off the top of my head. If you've been looking into getting a CNC, you probably already know all of this and have a specific use case in mind, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Overall, I had a really positive experience with this machine, as you could probably tell from the rest of this video. The majority of the issues that I had were my own fault and not the machine's, as far as I can tell. You know, with these videos, I always want to give you all a realistic look at using various types of maker technology, and that will also include when I do something stupid that results in things not working out too well in the end. But that does bring me to the first point that I wanted to talk about, and that is the ease of use or beginner friendliness of the Z1. I know a lot of people that have been wanting to jump into CNC machining are looking at the Z1, which is completely understandable. It's got a ton of amazing features for a much more reasonable price for a hobbyist. And even though I would consider the Z1 an incredibly beginner-friendly machine, you do still need to be willing to put in the time and effort to learn how to properly use it. And the majority of that learning is going to go towards learning how to properly set up the files so that this machine can produce the project that you're wanting it to. Makera have done an incredible job at creating an entire video library of tutorials to help people get started, so I would highly recommend checking out those to at the very least sort of see what you're getting yourselves into. There's videos that cover everything from basic CNC knowledge to more specifically their software and machines. We are still very much at the beginning stages of hobbyist CNC manufacturing, so you don't have that like base level of knowledge like I guess you would consider for 3D printing. Throughout this video, I tried to show and explain the process a little bit, but I also didn't want this video to come off as like information overload to anyone that was just watching this more for entertainment value of seeing the projects that I decided to make. 6 months ago, I had never touched a CNC machine, and now we are at a reasonable level of proficient other than the occasional hiccup and mind blank. The majority of the time, things do end up going well, and I'm able to create any project that I set out to make. But I did initially spend a week or two going through that entire video library and at the very least just learning the various terms that you really need to know to figure out what anything means. It is really also about learning how to properly set up the files and go about machining the various parts in the most efficient way. As with any new hobby, it is a bit of a learning curve, but there's a lot of great information out there to help you get started. Even though overall I had a great experience with the Makera Z1, I still have a list of pros, cons, and just general notes that I wanted to go through. I've probably already mentioned this, but just to remind you, this is technically a pre-production unit. I've been told that this one is basically what the final units will be, other than refining based on feedback, optimizing, finalizing firmware, all of that kind of stuff. There is a chance that there are going to be some changes to the final units, and some of the things that I'm about to mention might be moot points, which will be great. The biggest issue that I had with this machine was all thanks to this little button right there. As you can see, it's located right below where you'll be putting your hand when you open the lid. It's the only button that this machine has other than the power button. I don't know if it has a proper name, so for now we're just going to be calling it the button. But when you go to change a bit, you can press it instead of having to confirm the bit change on your computer, which is great and very handy because you are already at the machine and not necessarily beside your computer or whatever other device you are controlling this machine with. But right now, when the machine is running, if it gets pressed, it works like an emergency stop button, which is kind of confusing because this machine has its own separate emergency stop button. And I'm sure a lot of you can probably guess where I'm going with this tale about this button, because I don't even want to admit how many times I accidentally hit this thing and then had to restart whatever it was working on, fully if not partially. Thankfully, a lot of the time I could just re-export the tool paths from wherever I had accidentally stopped the machining at and then have it continue on from there. But this whole thing could have been avoided if this button was moved down maybe an inch, but even more simply just changing the functionality that it acts like a pause instead of a full stop. I don't know, maybe I was just having a really klutzy couple of weeks. I do fully understand the idea of why it is where it is, other than I would argue just move it down a tiny bit. But it is in very close proximity to where everyone is going to be sticking their hands to lift the lid to either vacuum out debris or just genuinely trying to go in to change the bit. It could get accidentally hit to confirm the bit change before you've managed to actually change the bit. So the lesson here is to be mindful of where you're putting your hands as you go to lift this lid, but also let's change that functionality to be a pause instead of a stop. Since I did sort of briefly mention vacuuming, throughout this video I was using the cyclone dust collector. The hose connects to a port on the back of the machine, and there's also an additional cable that can put the cyclone dust collector into auto mode, which means it smartly recognizes when the machine is actively cutting something and will turn itself on, or if it's finished a job, it will automatically shut off. Overall, it works pretty well. It does make for a very sleek setup over using something like a shop vac. As always, the vacuum tends to be louder than the machine itself. It is always a little dependent on what the machine is working on and the material that it's cutting. CNC machines in general are just a noisier type of machine. I would say it is quieter than the average shop vac, but it still does make quite a lot of noise given that it is still a vacuum. Since we are really on the topic of vacuuming, something to note is that the Z1 doesn't use a dust collar. Traditionally on a lot of CNC machines, you will have this like collar piece and it will essentially vacuum up the debris from around the bit. At least when you're working on a flat project, when you start doing fourth axis machining, you tend to need an air assist and that will blow debris away from the bit. But the Z1 has this new system on the tool head where it basically already has an air assist built in, and it is continuously blowing the debris away from the tool bit. It is kind of an added bonus that you don't need an air assist, but from the experience of working with this, at least so far, this is apparently something that is being worked on in firmware updates. But right now, there doesn't seem to be enough air pushing the debris away all of the time for then the debris and dust to fully move to the back of the machine where the vacuum is to collect. Because how it's working is the vacuum is sort of collecting dust and debris from the entire chamber and not just focused around the one area. The bottom of the machine is angled so that the debris will make its way towards the back of the machine where that vacuum suction is the strongest. But as I was using this machine, at least right now as it stands with the current firmware, I was still going in with a separate vacuum to clean out the chamber more. In general, I just like a cleaner environment, plus it was going to make it a lot easier to see what on earth the machine was doing on camera for you all. The dust collector was definitely working. It's not like it wasn't picking up anything because there was plenty of dust and debris that it was collecting, so it would have been even worse had I not been using it with some sort of dust collection. Which, speaking of the angled machine bottom, it is great for its intended dust and debris collecting purposes. Not great, however, if you are klutzy and fumble with tool bits. I may or may not have dropped at least one bit that then proceeded to roll into the back of the machine. Thankfully, I was able to retrieve it by shaking said machine so that it rolled out into the front. Listen, there may be easier access, but that just seemed like the simplest method. Obviously, when the machine was unplugged and not working, like, I'm not that crazy. You unfortunately can't really add or change anything to stop parts like that from falling towards the back, because then it would also stop the dust and debris from going back there. So I guess just be careful and steady-handed. A design feature that I was very happy to see added though is the lip around the front. It just makes it a lot better when you go to open the lid. It doesn't have the possibility of debris building up along the edge of the lid so that when you open it, the debris just like falls out and creates a mess on your table. Since we're on the topic of machine properties, the back panel can be removed so that larger material can pass through it. I didn't end up needing to use it this time around, but I'm sure it will come in handy in the future when I end up with a larger piece of stock than will fit within the enclosure. The Z1 does have a camera, but it's kind of at an odd angle. It really only shows the bottom left corner well, and then any material that is of a certain thickness, it just sort of blocks the entire view. But I also don't think it really matters because personally, I don't really see why a camera would necessarily be necessary, since you really shouldn't be leaving CNC machines unattended. So yeah, the camera placement isn't ideal, but then I also don't really see myself ever really using the camera, so I I kind of don't care. But with all that being said, I would still say that the positives greatly outweigh any possible negatives with this machine. The first one being that it works just as well as the more expensive Makera machines, just with a smaller work area. I will list all of the specific work area measurements here because there's no way I'm going to remember all of them off the top of my head. But even with the smaller work area, it is still very capable of producing larger projects, especially if you're smart about the way you go about manufacturing them. In general though, I think I would be able to fit probably like 95% of the projects that I typically work on this machine. I am a huge fan of being able to make myself custom metal greeblies for various Star Wars projects. More recently, you might have seen me machining the little disc details for Chewbacca's bandolier, but being able to produce custom metal pieces like that is just unmatched and always so much fun. Another huge pro for this machine is that it comes with free cam software, so there's no hidden extra cost. Makera Cam is simple, but it is also functional, and I would say has the added benefit of not being so overly complex that it completely overwhelms a beginner. There are some features that I'd like to see added, as well as UI improvements, but it still ends up being able to produce all of the projects that I'm interested in making. The Z1 can still be used with other more advanced cam software if you find that Makera Cam maybe doesn't have a feature that you'd like to use or want to upgrade to something more advanced in the future. Another massive pro for this machine are all of the tutorials that I mentioned earlier in the video, so I won't repeat myself here. Another very intriguing pro for this machine is the new Makerables website. It is very much like all of the 3D printing websites that I'm sure many of you are familiar with that have all of these pre-made files that you can then reproduce yourself on your own machine. And a website like this is fantastic for project ideas and getting people into the hobby. Once the website becomes more public and operational, I will definitely be adding that bit holder at the very least for anyone that wants to make their own. Personally, I'm very interested in seeing what the future of the Makerables website looks like and how that might affect people's idea of how accessible CNC machining is, given that there are all of these pre-made projects. If you're someone who's been interested in the Makera Z1, I think it's a great option and fantastic machine. It's going to make the possibility of CNC machining so much more accessible to people who have been interested in jumping into this as a hobby, and I can't wait to see what the future of this machine and the community it has the potential of building holds. If you'd like to find out even more information about the Makera Z1, there will be links in the description box. But that is everything. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.